To tell a compelling story, we need a few things. A central conflict, obstacles to progress, and, of course, a protagonist. Without these building blocks, it is a struggle to tell a tale of adversity and triumph, of tension and release, a tale with stakes and a message which will stay with those who experience it. And it is exactly this narrativism that makes fantasy media a Trojan horse for one of the largest falsehoods in history. The myth of the great man. In the modern study of history, it is well understood that the events of the past are a result of a confluence of factors, often economic, social, political, and experiential, affecting all people within a system, and that boiling down an event, war, or invention to a discrete, specific decision, cause, or inventor is reductive and, frankly, intellectually dishonest. It is at the intersection of myriad different pressures, ideas, and perspectives that notable things happen. And notable things are always happening everywhere around the world, even if most of us will never hear of them. See, it used to be that the study of history was not a study of complex pressures and influences, but instead partly a study of the tactics, rulership, and law of certain key historical figures, and partly an attempt to make an argument about a singular cause for a historical event. These great men, these great figures, your Alexanders, your Caesars, your Martin Luthers, your Churchills, they were positioned as people who directly and specifically took actions that changed the shape of the world, that changed history in such a direct, forceful and charismatic way that nothing would ever be the same again. The complexity of the matter is that this isn't completely false. The actions and decisions of these men, I mean, it's almost always men, especially with early historians, they are considered turning points for the history of the world even today. It's hard to imagine a Greek empire that doesn't have a large-scale effect on the intellectual development of the world from Christianity to Buddhism, or a Europe without Kaisers or Caesars, an America without the Protestant work ethic and cross-Atlantic religious persecution, or a Britain without a charismatic war-fighting prime minister in the 40s. These people, these great men, as they're called as part of the great men theory, undeniably changed the shape of the world by their own actions. But if they'd never existed, it's difficult to say that things would be much different. If Alexander's father, Philip II, didn't have a son and heir, his expansion may have been less bold than it was in actuality. Yet he may have nonetheless united the Greeks under his own banner, perhaps even avoiding an early grave by assassination by doing so. Caesar wasn't Rome's first dictator, or most accomplished general. He was an incredibly accomplished statesman, yes, but the prestige that Caesar has is largely generated by the use of his image, his name, and his vibe by his immediate successors to gain some sort of legitimate tie to authority from the past. Martin Luther was certainly not the only disgruntled churchman in early 16th century Europe, and 1940s Britain wasn't exactly short of hard-headed aristocratic politicians. The point is, myriad cultural forces were shifting alongside the rise of these so-called great men. And it did not have to be these individuals, with their super special ultimate genius and leadership of men, who filled that gap, who stepped into a situation that was poised for change and made change happen. Yes, change would look different. Yes, there would be marginally less successful. Yes, we would see differences in history, but fundamentally, Greece was going to expand. Rome was tending towards a consolidation of power. Early 16th century Europe, with the controversy of indulgences, was a powder keg. And I feel it is a discredit to the resilience and ingenuity of Britons around the country in the 40s to credit Churchill with a groundswell of inspiration that leads to victory. Yes, he was a good propagandist and a decent strategist. But a lot more things were done by a lot more people, and that's the whole point. It's about everything that is happening holistically in a system at the time. And the charisma of a specific individual, yes, that helps in motivating things or pushing things in a certain direction or leading to a specific variety of the outcome. But the stage was set. I mean, the best example of these great men, although this isn't a great man by any stretch of the imagination, being in the right place at the right time and theoretically replaceable, is Hitler. He starts his political career in the 20s, largely focused on critiquing the terms of German surrender in the Treaty of Versailles. Just like most of the German populace, his charisma and rhetoric are the main reasons he ends up as the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in the 20s. And he was very, very lucky not to get killed during his failed coup in 1923, which kick-started his fame across the country, not just in Bavaria. It could have been anyone. Anti-Versailles sentiments were widely held. And what would have changed is perhaps the severity of the prejudice and racism, and possibly the flavour of nationalism that we'd see spread. Possibly a monarchic restoration as opposed to a bureaucratic governmental dominance. The underlying tensions, the feelings of people across a nation, the difficulties, the economic realities, they don't change. That's some part of why the great man theory of history is so widely rejected today. Because German resentment in the 20s, buoyed up by reparations and hyperinflation, were the main powder keg in which everything exploded. But what's all this got to do with fantasy? Well, as I mentioned at the start of the video, all compelling narratives need protagonists, or at least active agents, to move events along. It's quite hard to write a narrative about complex structural issues inspiring many small changes across a population, building to a sea change, a tipping point, where events balloon into something massive, impactful and dramatic. It's far easier to create that same story through the eyes of one single participant. But then, to see everything, to experience all of the strange things going on, our participant has to be a very, very active agent indeed. And to have a sense of chaos, that participant needs to physically, personally shape some part of that great event that occurs, either causing it, stopping it, influencing it, and having their own stamp on history. Probably the best story I've read about a collection of difficult social pressures causing people across a civilization to act is actually a short story by Isaac Asimov. It's a masterpiece. The Last Question, it's called, and if you haven't read it, please do. It's really quite short, and it will probably make your day if you haven't read it before. But surely the problem of having to make a narrative and having to have a protagonist is not unique to fantasy. All media is going to struggle to tell the story of intersectional social politics and economic pressures unless it's a documentary or non-fiction text designed to tease out these complexities. All fiction must then struggle with making great men out to be the active agents in a world. Then, with the need for relatable characters that we recognise from scene to scene, and a hope of a satisfying resolution for that particular character's storyline. Except I would argue that fantasy has probably the hardest time of all forming a story without that classic formulation of an active protagonist, a great man to shape the future. See, fantasy fiction owes a lot to folktales, myths, and legends, which are filled with heroes and villains, movers and shakers, because these tales are used to explain and make sense of our mythic past. It's the same reason that we've always liked great man narratives. We've always told great man narratives. And we still do today with the likes of Bill Gates, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. These tales are simpler to tell and they're more immediately passable. You can get to the message faster. Who won the battle at Jericho? Joshua, with some help from God. Who invented the radio? Marconi? No, Tesla. Hell, even the ever-present Edison versus Tesla debate, it's the same thing. You can't credit inventions to one person, as each new invention relies on mechanisms, techniques and theoretical understandings developed by dozens of others to serve as a fundamental grounding space that the invention can even be built on top of. Newton's famous statement, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." It really fits here. We love to simplify these tales to create a hero because it just makes things easier for us to remember and to pass. Even when we're trying to right wrongs, as in the case of Tesla, it is a disservice to point to a technology and say, that was him. Even if we're explicitly discussing a machine that Tesla himself built on his own, they still take advantage of the theoretical understandings of the past and machined parts, machined to such a precision that they couldn't have been made to less than 100 years prior. As humans, we are busy both intellectually and socially. And most of the time, a nuanced, caveat-filled, technically correct discussion just isn't worth it socially or practically. Having a notion of gravity as a fundamental force that affects all things with mass is less useful most of the time than the shorthand of things fall down. Narrative efficiency is an evolutionary adaptation to get the point across faster, which is why our most ancient and fundamental tales, folk tales and legends rely on heroes, on quests, and why the Iliad boils down to a few major players having duels, building feuds, and being clever at each other. Yes, fantasy is a broad and varied genre with a genuine effort, especially in the modern day, to escape the mythic and legendary influences of the genre's beginnings. But the notion of hero seems baked in, mostly. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey is a cultural touchstone for fantasy authors for a reason. So what can we do as a community to better reflect the trajectory of history as a series of social pressures on all people, as opposed to a story of a variety of important decisions made by someone special and awesome? Well, as I said, the fantasy space is not a monolith. For example, my absolute favourite fantasy texts are not novels, plays, poems, or even manga. I adore setting guides with all my heart. I mean, this kind of text is only really useful if you really want to delve into the deep lore of your favourite setting, or if you're looking to tell stories of your own using pieces from that setting. Among my favourite texts from George R.R. Martin and his creative team around him, a bunch of other writers as well, is The World of Ice and Fire. It's a speculative history book of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. Of course, this is eclipsed as my favourite book from him by Tough Voyaging, a hill which I will die on. Generally, I have a great affection for anyone willing to publish a setting guide or a world's history with a proper meatiness to it, as having demographic information, a broad timeline of social and technological development, and an account of the broad international social pressures on people around the world. It's a far more open look at a world than a narrative coloured by its need to have a readership connect with a character. But a setting book can only take you so far in this way. People crave story, they crave narratives, and speculative non-fiction won't always scratch that itch. But I will say that entourage or anthology style series are still popular. Now, of course, the temptation often comes in, even in these stories, to focus on characters who are going to be critical to events to come. But at least we get to see multiple lives in some focus, circling a shared set of social conditions, which affect the decision-making of different people in different ways, and affect the way that their worlds make meaning, their individual lives make meaning, on a large scale. Even if this group of disparate ragtag heroes are eventually going to join forces and come together to save the world. You know, we can only go so far. I understand that this complaint. And my proposed solutions are, frankly, trivial. And that what I'm kind of suggesting is that everyone who writes fantasy media should be trying to recreate Cloud Atlas, or at the very least, A Song of Ice and Fire. And not everyone wants to do that, and that's a fair critique, especially as this issue of fiction priming our minds to recognise and revere and intuitively understand the great man theory of history isn't the biggest problem of our modern age. But I hope I at least make you consider. Because even the most seemingly banal and basic attempts at creating action and drama can be remarkably complex, engaging, and illustrative when observed outside the mould of protagonism and antagonism. Potential and chosen ones. And there's no better example of that, I feel, than the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Watching back, especially The Phantom Menace, there is so much going on behind the scenes that we really should be paying attention to, and that enhances our understanding of the actions of all the characters in the film. Except maybe Jar Jar, but no, even Jar Jar is to some extent a victim and participant in the segregation and complex relationship between the two established monarchical factions on Naboo. But with all that said, I hope I have made you think a little bit more. And do let me know your thoughts on all of this, whether I'm going too far or whether this is genuinely something you've also been bothered by in our most popular and favourite tales. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.